The widow rode south with a bundle wrapped in deerskin and a rifle she had not fired in 3 years. Behind her lay burned lodges and empty grazing land. Ahead lay Texas, where Comanche women traveled only with men or not at all. Subscribe for more true-style Western stories, and comment where you're watching from. Her name was Nadua, though the white settlements called her something else when they bothered to call her anything. She had lived 42 winters. Her husband had died that spring from fever, not battle. Her son had ridden north with the last hunting band and had not returned. The agent at the fort said the bands were finished, that the reservation would take anyone who came in peacefully. Nadua had listened and said nothing. 3 days later she packed her belongings and left before dawn. The plains in summer offered no mercy. Grass grew tall and dry. Waterholes shrank to mud. The sun bleached bone and wood alike. Nadua rode a gray mare that had belonged to her husband. The mare was old, but sure-footed. She knew how to travel long distances without complaint. Nadua carried cornmeal, dried meat, and a waterskin. She rationed carefully. The journey she planned would take weeks if the weather held and longer if it did not. She traveled during early morning and late evening, resting through the midday heat beneath whatever shade she could find. Mesquite trees, dry creek banks, rock outcrops that cast thin shadows. She built no fires. Smoke carried far on the plains and drew attention she could not afford. At night she slept with the rifle across her chest and woke at every sound. On the 4th day she passed a burned wagon. The canvas top had collapsed inward. Broken wheels lay half buried in the dirt. She did not stop to examine it closely. Whoever had traveled in that wagon was long gone, either dead or taken, or fled on foot. The plains held many such remnants. They marked the passage of people who had misjudged the land or their own capacity to cross it. She rode on. The bundle she carried weighed little, but she guarded it carefully. She had wrapped it in deerskin and tied it with rawhide cord. It rested in front of her on the mare, and she checked the knots each time she stopped. Inside was a tobacco pouch that had belonged to her husband, a cedar flute her son had carved as a boy, and a small leather bag containing items she did not name even to herself. The bundle was the reason for her journey, though no one who saw her would have known that. By the 2nd week, she reached the edge of settled country. Homesteads appeared in the distance, small squares of plowed earth surrounded by split-rail fences. She avoided them when she could. When she could not, she rode past quickly and did not meet the eyes of anyone who watched. Women standing in doorways. Men pausing in their work. Children who stopped playing to stare. She knew what they saw. A Comanche woman alone. Middle-aged and silent, dressed in buckskin and riding a worn-out horse. Some would see her as a threat, others as a curiosity. A few might see her as something to be pitied or converted or driven off. None of them would see her as she was. One evening she stopped near a creek that ran between 2 hills. The water was low but clean. She let the mare drink and filled her waterskin. While she worked, a man appeared on the far side of the creek. He was young, perhaps 25, with a patchy beard and a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He did not point it at her, but he did not lower it either. The man asked where she was going. Nadua said nothing. He asked again, louder this time, as though volume would make her understand. She finished filling the waterskin and stood slowly. The man shifted his weight. He told her there was no Comanche land here anymore, that she needed to go back north to the reservation. Nadua tied the waterskin to her saddle and mounted the mare. The man stepped into the creek, water rising to his knees. He said he was not trying to cause trouble, but that folks around here did not want Indians passing through without reason. Nadua turned the mare and rode away. The man did not follow. She heard him shout something behind her, but the words were lost in the distance. She camped that night in a stand of oak trees and did not sleep well. The encounter had reminded her that the land she crossed was no longer open. It had been divided and claimed. Fences marked boundaries that had not existed 10 years earlier. Roads cut through grazing grounds. Towns rose where hunting camps had stood. The people who lived here now believed the land had always been theirs, or that it should have been, or that it was theirs because they had taken it. Nadua did not argue these things in her mind. She simply rode through, careful and quiet, hoping to pass unnoticed. 3 days later, she came upon a group of men camped near a dry riverbed. There were 5 of them. They had no wagons, only horses and bedrolls. They saw her before she could turn away. One of them called out. She kept riding. 2 of the men mounted quickly and rode to intercept her. They came at her from both sides, cutting off her path. The Mare stopped, ears flat. The first man was older, lean and sun-darkened, with a scar running from his cheekbone to his jaw. He asked what she was doing out here alone. Nadua did not answer. The second man, younger and heavier, circled around behind her. He said she must be lost. The older man laughed. He said Comanche women did not get lost. He asked if she had anything worth trading. Nadua kept her hands visible. The rifle was tied to her saddle within reach, but she did not move toward it. The older man leaned forward in his saddle. He asked again about trading. His tone had changed. It was no longer a question. The other 3 men rode up from the camp. They formed a loose circle around her. One of them, a boy barely old enough to grow a mustache, stared at the bundle tied to her saddle. He pointed and asked what was in it. The older man told him to be quiet. He said they were not thieves. He said if the woman had something to trade, they would make a fair exchange. If not, she could ride on. Nadua watched him closely. His eyes moved from her face to the bundle, to the rifle and back. He was deciding something. The other men waited. The silence stretched long enough that the horses began to shift and stamp. Finally, the older man straightened. He said she could go. The men pulled their horses aside, opening a gap in the circle. Nadua nudged the Mare forward. She rode slowly, not looking back, until she was out of sight. Then she urged the Mare into a trot and did not stop until nightfall. She thought about the men as she made camp that evening. They had been outlaws or drifters, the kind who lived between towns and laws, taking what they could when they could. She had seen such men before. Some were violent. Others were simply desperate. The older man had been neither, or both, or something in between. He had let her go not out of kindness, but because he had calculated the risk and decided it was not worth taking. That kind of calculation kept people alive out here. Nadua understood it well. The next week brought rain. It fell in heavy sheets that turned the ground to mud and swelled the creeks. Nadua wrapped the bundle in oilcloth and kept riding. The Mare struggled in the deep mud, but did not quit. They traveled slower. Water pooled in the low places and the high ground became slick. Nadua's clothes stayed wet. At night she shivered beneath a blanket that offered little warmth. When the rain stopped, the heat returned, worse than before. Steam rose from the ground. Insects swarmed in thick clouds. The Mare developed sores on her back where the saddle rubbed. Nadua treated them with a salve made from plant roots, but the sores did not heal quickly. She walked more often, leading the Mare to spare her weight. Hunger became a concern. The dried meat was nearly gone. The cornmeal had gotten wet and spoiled. Nadua set snares for rabbits, but caught nothing. She found wild onions and ate them raw. She chewed strips of bark to quiet her stomach. The land here was less generous than the plains farther north. It had been grazed hard and plowed in places. Game was scarce. One afternoon she saw a farmhouse in the distance. Smoke rose from the chimney. A vegetable garden grew beside it, fenced against deer. Nadua watched from a hillside for a long time. She saw a woman come out to hang laundry. A dog slept in the shade of the porch. No men were visible. She considered her options. She could ask for food. She could offer to work in exchange. She could steal from the garden at night. Or she could ride on and hope to find game farther south. Each choice carried risk. She decided to approach. She rode slowly toward the house, staying in plain view. The dog woke and began barking. The woman turned from the laundry line and shaded her eyes. She watched Nadua approach but did not go inside. That was a good sign. When Nadua was close enough, she stopped the mare and waited. The woman was in her 30s, thin and tired-looking, with brown hair tied back under a faded bonnet. She held a wet sheet in her hands. She asked what Nadua wanted. Her voice was cautious but not hostile. Nadua pointed to the garden and then to her mouth. The woman frowned. She looked past Nadua as though checking for others. Then she looked at the mare, at the worn saddle, at Nadua's gaunt face. The woman told her to wait. She went inside the house and returned with a small sack. She walked halfway across the yard and set it on the ground. Then she stepped back. Nadua dismounted and picked up the sack. Inside was cornbread, a piece of salt pork, and 3 withered apples. Nadua nodded to the woman. The woman nodded back. Neither spoke again. Nadua mounted and rode away. That night she ate slowly, making the food last. The cornbread was dry but filling. The salt pork was tough. The apples were sweet despite their wrinkled skin. She thought about the woman who had given them to her. The woman had not asked questions. She had not demanded anything in return. She had simply seen need and responded to it. Such exchanges were rare, but they happened. They reminded Nadua that mercy existed even in hard places. By the 4th week, she reached the region she had been traveling toward. The land changed. The plains gave way to rolling hills covered in cedar and oak. Creeks ran clearer. The air smelled different, greener, though the heat remained. She began to recognize landmarks from long ago. A bent tree, a rock formation, a bend in a river. She had traveled this country as a girl, before the settlements, before the wars, when the bands moved freely and the buffalo covered the plains like dark clouds. She camped one evening near a spring that bubbled up from limestone. She knelt and drank deeply. The water was cold and clean. She filled her waterskin and let the mare drink her fill. Then she sat with her back against a tree and unwrapped the bundle for the first time since leaving. Inside was the tobacco pouch, the cedar flute, and the leather bag. She opened the bag carefully. Inside were 3 small bundles of cloth. She unfolded the first. It contained a lock of black hair tied with sinew. The second held a baby tooth. The third held a fragment of a child's moccasin, decorated with small blue beads. These items had belonged to a daughter who had died 30 years earlier. The girl had been 6 years old when fever took her. Nadua had buried her on a hillside overlooking the spring. The grave had no marker. Comanche custom did not use markers. But Nadua remembered the place exactly. She had carried these items for 3 decades, moving them from camp to camp, keeping them close. When her husband died and her son disappeared, and the reservation agent began pressuring the remaining families to give up their old ways, Nadua had decided the time had come to return them to the grave. She had not ridden south to flee. She had not ridden to find her son or to join another band. She had ridden south to keep a promise she had made to herself when her daughter died. She had promised that when her own time came to leave the plains, she would not go without honoring the child's memory one last time. The journey had not been about survival. It had been about remembrance. The next morning she rode to the hillside. It took her an hour to find the exact spot. The land had changed. Grass grew thicker. A cedar tree had sprouted near where she thought the grave lay. She dismounted and walked slowly, reading the slope of the ground, the way water would have drained, the angle of the sun. Finally she found a slight depression in the earth, oval-shaped and shallow. This was the place. She knelt and used her hands to dig. The soil was hard and dry. She worked slowly, careful not to disturb more than necessary. When she had dug down the length of her forearm, she stopped. She placed the 3 cloth bundles in the hole. She covered them with earth and patted it smooth. Then she sat beside the grave and spoke quietly in Comanche. She told her daughter about the years that had passed. She spoke about her father and her brother. She spoke about the changes on the plains and the hardness of recent times. She spoke about how she had carried these items for so long and how it felt to finally return them. When she finished speaking, she stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. She looked out across the hills. The morning sun lit the treetops. Birds called from the branches. A breeze stirred the grass. The place was peaceful. It seemed right that her daughter rested here. She turned to walk back to the mare and found a man standing at the base of the hill. He was white, middle-aged, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He held no weapon that she could see. He had been watching her. She did not know for how long. The man removed his hat. He said he had not meant to intrude. He said he had been riding through and had seen her horse and had come to see if anyone needed help. His voice was calm, formal. He spoke as though addressing someone of equal standing. Nadua said nothing. She walked past him toward the mar. The man replaced his hat and followed at a respectful distance. He asked if she was traveling alone. She nodded. He said that was dangerous for anyone, man or woman, Indian or white. He asked where she was headed. Nadua stopped beside the mare. She looked at the man directly. She told him, in slow, clear English, that she had come to visit a grave and that she was finished. The man blinked, surprised by her English. He asked whose grave. She told him it was her daughter's. He nodded slowly. He said he was sorry for her loss. He did not ask how long ago the girl had died or why she was buried here. He simply expressed sympathy and then stepped back. He told her there was a town 10 miles south if she needed supplies. He said people there were wary of Indians, but that the shopkeeper was fair and would not cheat her if she had money to spend. Nadua thanked him. The man nodded and walked to his own horse, which waited in the shade of an oak tree. He mounted and rode away without looking back. Nadua remained standing beside the mare for a long time. She thought about the man's reaction. He had not questioned her presence or her right to be here. He had not assumed she was trespassing or that the grave was somehow improper. He had simply acknowledged her grief and offered information that might be useful. Such encounters were rare, but they reminded her that not all white men were the same, just as not all Comanche were the same. People carried their own codes, their own sense of what was right. The land did not care about these codes. It tested everyone equally. She decided to ride to the town. It took most of the day. The town was small, just a main street with a dozen buildings. A general store, a saloon, a stable, a church with a crooked steeple. People stopped to watch as she rode through. Some stared openly. Others turned away. A woman pulled her children inside a shop. A man leaning against a post spat into the street. Nadua rode to the general store and dismounted. She tied the mare to the rail and went inside. The shopkeeper was a gray-haired man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up from a ledger. His expression was neutral. He asked what she needed. Nadua told him she wanted cornmeal, salt pork, and ammunition for her rifle. The shopkeeper nodded. He gathered the items and placed them on the counter. He named a price. Nadua reached into a small pouch tied at her waist and counted out coins. They were Mexican silver, old but still good. The shopkeeper examined them briefly and then swept them into a drawer. He wrapped the supplies in brown paper and handed them across the counter. As Nadua turned to leave, the shopkeeper spoke again. He said she should be careful traveling alone. He said there had been trouble south of here, gangs of men robbing travelers and burning homesteads. He said the law had not caught them yet. Nadua thanked him for the warning. She left the store and loaded the supplies onto the mare. She rode out of town the way she had come. No one followed her. No one spoke to her. She was simply another traveler passing through, remarkable only for being alone and being Comanche. That night she camped in a dry wash and ate a small meal. She thought about the shopkeeper's warning. She had traveled hundreds of miles without serious trouble. She had avoided conflict when possible and had been prepared for it when necessary. But the journey was not finished. She still had to ride north, back through the same country she had crossed, and the return would be no safer than the outward trip. She also thought about the grave. She had done what she came to do. The items were returned. The promise was kept. She felt lighter, as though she had set down a burden she had carried so long she had forgotten its weight. But the lightness brought its own kind of sorrow. Without the burden, she was untethered. Her daughter was truly gone now, not just dead but released. The physical tokens that had connected them were buried. What remained was only memory, and memory faded. She slept poorly. The next morning she turned north and began the long ride back. The return journey differed from the first. Nadua traveled faster, no longer pausing to scout each landmark or to rest during the heat of the day. The task was finished. Now it was simply a matter of reaching the northern plains before winter came. The Mare sensed the change in urgency and walked with more energy despite her sores and age. On the third day, Nadua came across a burned homestead. The house had collapsed into its foundation. The barn was a blackened frame. Fences lay in pieces. 3 graves had been dug in the yard, marked with rough wooden crosses. The destruction was recent. Ash still powdered the ground. She did not stop. 2 days later, she saw smoke rising from a distant hillside. She altered her course to avoid it. That evening she heard gunfire, faint but distinct, coming from the west. She made no fire and kept the Mare saddled through the night in case she needed to move quickly. The next morning she encountered the gang the shopkeeper had warned her about. There were 8 of them, riding in a loose group along a ridge. They spotted her before she could hide. One of them shouted and pointed. The group turned and rode toward her at a gallop. Nadua kicked the Mare into a run. The old horse responded, but she was no match for younger, stronger animals. Within minutes the men surrounded her and forced her to stop. The leader was a heavy man with a red beard and a revolver on each hip. He demanded to know where she was going. Nadua did not answer. He asked if she had money or goods worth taking. She remained silent. He leaned closer and told her that silence would not help her. He said they could search her and take what they wanted, or she could hand it over peacefully. One of the other men rode up beside the bundle tied to her saddle. He reached for it. Nadua grabbed his wrist. The man jerked back, surprised. The leader laughed. He said she had spirit. He told the man to leave the bundle alone and asked Nadua again what she was carrying. Nadua said it was nothing of value. The leader said he would decide that. He told her to hand it over. Nadua refused. The leader's expression hardened. He drew one of his revolvers and pointed it at her chest. He said he would not ask again. Nadua untied the bundle and handed it to him. The leader opened it. He pulled out the tobacco pouch, the flute, and the empty leather bag. He turned them over in his hands. He seemed confused. He asked where the valuables were. Nadua told him there were none. The leader threw the items to the ground. He said she was wasting his time. One of the other men suggested they take the horse and rifle. The leader considered this. He looked at the Mare, old and sore-backed. He looked at the rifle, worn and outdated. He said they were not worth the trouble. He told Nadua to pick up her things and ride on. He said if they saw her again, he would not be so generous. The men wheeled their horses and rode away. Nadua dismounted and gathered the items from the dirt. The tobacco pouch was torn. The flute had a crack along its length. The leather bag was trampled but intact. She wrapped them carefully and retied the bundle to her saddle. Then she mounted and rode north. She did not stop until dark. That night she sat by a cold camp and examined the flute. The crack ran from the mouthpiece to the first finger hole. It was deep enough that the flute would no longer play true. She had carried this item for weeks, guarding it carefully, intending to keep it as the last physical memory of her son. Now it was damaged, broken by men who had seen no value in it beyond whatever price it might fetch. She thought about the leader's decision to let her go. He had looked at her belongings and her horse and her worn clothes, and had judged her not worth robbing. That judgment had saved her life, but it also highlighted the invisible state she occupied. She was neither threat nor prize. She was simply there, moving through a land that no longer had a place for her. The following week brought no further encounters. The plains stretched empty and wide. Nadua crossed familiar ground. She passed the dry riverbed where she had met the first group of men. She passed the creek where the young farmer had questioned her. She passed the burned wagon and the empty homesteads. The land remained the same, but the journey had changed her. She was no longer carrying something forward. She was simply returning. On the 20th day, she reached the edge of Comanche country, or what had been Comanche country before the boundaries shifted. A dirt road ran east to west. A military patrol rode along it. 6 soldiers in blue uniforms. They saw her and rode over. The sergeant asked for identification. Nadua had none. He asked where she was coming from and where she was going. She told him she was returning to the agency. He asked why she had left. She said she had personal business to attend to. The sergeant looked skeptical. He said Indians were not supposed to travel without permission from the agent. He said he should take her back under guard. One of the younger soldiers said they did not have time for that. The sergeant agreed reluctantly. He told Nadua to report to the agency within 2 days, or he would send men to find her. Nadua nodded. The soldiers rode on. She reached the agency the next evening. It was a collection of rough buildings surrounding a dusty yard. A flagpole stood in the center. Families camped in tipis and canvas shelters on the outskirts. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played in the dirt. Men sat in groups, talking quietly. Women worked at various tasks, grinding corn or sewing or tending to infants. Nadua rode through the camp slowly. A few people looked up. Some recognized her. Most did not. She had been gone for more than a month. In that time, others had arrived, pushed in by soldiers or hunger or the simple exhaustion of resisting. The camp had grown, but it had not prospered. People looked thin. Supplies were limited. The agent had promised rations, but the deliveries were irregular and insufficient. Nadua found a place on the edge of the camp and set up a small shelter. She unsaddled the mare and rubbed her down. The horse had traveled hundreds of miles. Her sores had healed poorly. Her ribs showed, but she had completed the journey. Nadua fed her the last of the cornmeal mixed with water and promised her rest. That night an old woman came to Nadua's fire. She asked where Nadua had been. Nadua told her she had ridden south to visit a grave. The old woman nodded. She did not ask whose grave. She said others had left too, trying to reach relatives in Mexico or to find land not yet claimed by settlers. Most had not returned. She asked if Nadua had found what she was looking for. Nadua said she had. The old woman said that was good. She said the world was closing in and soon there would be no place left to ride to. She said people had to find their peace where they could, while they could. Then she stood and walked back to her own fire. Nadua sat alone and watched the flames. She thought about the journey and what it had cost. The mare would not recover fully. The supplies were gone. The bundle was damaged. But the grave had been tended. The promise had been kept. The daughter had been remembered one last time before the world moved on. She thought about the lesson the journey had taught her, though she did not name it as a lesson. She had learned that memory required action, that honoring the dead meant more than carrying their belongings. She had learned that the land did not care who crossed it or why, only that they were strong enough to endure the crossing. She had learned that mercy existed in unexpected places and cruelty in predictable ones. She had learned that being invisible could be both a protection and a punishment. Most of all, she had learned that some journeys were not about reaching a destination. They were about proving to yourself that you could still make the ride, that age and loss and the closing of the world had not taken everything from you. The ride itself was the point. The fact that she had gone and returned was what mattered. The fire burned low. Nadua lay down on her blanket and closed her eyes. The next morning she would report to the agent. She would answer his questions. She would accept whatever rations he offered. She would settle into the rhythms of camp life, the slow diminishment of a people who had once moved freely across 1,000 miles of grass. But tonight she was still the widow who had ridden south alone. Tonight she was still the woman who had kept her promise. The journey was finished, but the memory of it would remain. And in a world that was forgetting who the Comanche had been, that memory was worth the ride. Create a Leonardo.ai thumbnail prompt for each act. Semi-sexy dress version.